Greetings. You may have seen my previous video providing an overview of the ScaleTrains -9 from a BNSF modeler's perspective. This next series of videos will use this model as a base to model a specific prototype, BNSF 4555. These videos will cover detailing, installation of sound, and of course weathering the model. I hope that you learned something from these videos and that you can apply it to your own modeling. So, follow along with me as we improve a ScaleTrains -9 and turn it into this, a model of a very specific prototype, improving the detailing, sound, and of course weathering in order to accurately reflect a specific prototype. First up will be disassembly of the model. Begin by removing the couplers. Carefully flip the model over, unscrew the screws, and gently remove the coupler boxes from both ends. Turn the model back over and gently remove the shell from the chassis. Set the chassis aside. I like to remove all the handrails from my models before I weather them. I typically will just use a blunt blade and carefully pop them out of the holes, careful not to break anything. Afterwards, I'll set them aside in a safe place so that they don't get bent or broken, and I'll go through and I'll do the same for any other handrails that might be in the way. Sometimes I will leave the front and rear handrails on because I can typically weather around them. Next, we will remove and improve the windows. First, I removed all the details around the windows. I took off the handrails above the windshields, carefully removing them using a blade, and once removed I set them aside for safekeeping because I would reinstall them later. After that, I then started work on the windshield wipers. These were actually much more difficult to remove, so you will need to be careful doing that. With the details out of the way, the windows can be easily accessed. I use the tip of a blade and carefully pry between the windows and the cab and gently pull them away. The windows are held in place with a tacky glue, which makes removal and reinstallation fairly simple. Just be careful not to scratch the glass itself. I removed all the windows, including the windshields, as well as all the side windows, front and back as well. I carefully removed them and laid them aside so that I knew where they went. On the engineer's side, I had to remove the small mirror and set that aside as well. Again, I carefully removed the window in the cab door as well as the two rear windows. I did not remove the glass over the number boards. Next, I took the windshields using gloves so that I did not put fingerprints on the glass. I then used a Sharpie, black, and traced around the edges of the glass. This will help it to appear invisible once it is reinstalled. I went all the way around the edges without getting anything on the front or rear facing plates of the glass. I then used black acrylic paint and painted the mounting surfaces on the cab to cover up the orange so that it does not show through the glass. I painted all surfaces of the mounting areas on the windshields and rear windows only. I then used some modeling glue that is made for glass and window installation that dries clear, and put a few dabs on the mounting surfaces here and there. I then carefully took the glass and installed it in the correct orientation with the window heater, the line at the top. For the side windows, I put them face down on a piece of tape and then colored the back of them using a black Sharpie marker in order to increase the tint, because from ScaleTrains it was far too light. Once dry, I reinstalled the windows onto the sides of the model. The tacky glue that came from ScaleTrains was still in good shape on the sides, and because I did not paint over it, I did not have to apply any more glue. I loosely put the windows back into place, and after I was done initial placement, then I went back through and corrected any rotations and made sure that all the mounting was flush on all sides. Now look at the model before anything was done. You can see the orange through the glass. Now compare that to the after result, where now the windshields appear much thinner and you can't see so easily through the side windows. Let's move on to correcting the underframe. ScaleTrains has two ribs on the fuel tank that are not correct for the BNSF models. These can be easily enough removed using a sharp flat blade and carefully removing the lines on all sides of the fuel tank. Don't worry too much about taking off some of the paint. That can all be corrected later. After using the blade, I go back with a little bit of sanding and smooth off the edges and try to blend them in as much as possible. Moving on now to the cab details. Using Archer transfer details, I add some louvers onto the engineer side of the cab according to my prototype photos. I use Walther Solvaset to hold it in place. The series that I'm modeling has an additional detail behind the conductor side of the cab. There is a thicker panel there with two grab irons on the side and one on the top. I added the grab irons to a piece of styrene that was cut to size, and then I added that directly to the model. Since I am modeling BNSF 4555, I had to remove the numbers that were applied from the factory. I coated them first in Walther Solvaset, and then I carefully used the edge of a curved blade and gently scraped off the numbers. After letting the Solvaset sit for a minute or two, it softens them up and it makes removal very easy without damaging the underlying paint. Using rough measurements I found online, I made a model of STI Core's long antenna dome for use on the cab roof. I exported that into an STL file and loaded it into my 3D slicing program for printing. I then printed the models and painted them prior to taking them off the mold and putting them on the cab. I carefully glued them to the cab, following prototype photos, and adjusted the seating afterwards. Finally, on the cab, I needed to get rid of the line that appears on the nose of the cab that is incorrect for the BNSF prototypes that I've seen. I filled this in using Bondo spot filler putty. I found that this is far less expensive to use than the specific modeling putties, and it does a fantastic job. Apply it like normal, let it dry, and then sand and finish afterwards. And finally, we make some improvements on the long hood. The horn as supplied on the model is correct for a lot of BNSF units. For BNSF 4555 it's not. That particular unit has a Leslie RS3L. So I had to work to get the old horn off, and then I used a spare horn from an old project. I believe this is off of an Athearn, and put that into place. The stock brake wheel is not that great, so it's easily removed. I had to widen the hole slightly in order to accept a Katie modern brake wheel that is far more correct for the prototype and just better molded all the way in general. After putting it in place, I then painted it on the model. ScaleTrains missed that the rear X panel on either side of the long hood is supposed to be longer than the front panel. On the model they're both the same size, so I carefully removed the rear X panel on both sides using a blade and finishing with a Dremel and some sandpaper. I then used some .004 inch thick brass sheet, cut to size, and created my own X panels following directions from Tony Sissons to find something that would replicate the X panel somewhat decently here. Probably not my best effort, to be honest, but it's workable, I think. And you can see them here installed longer than the front panel, and roughly the right amount of dimensions there, but if I were to do it all over again, I would have taken both panels off and just redone it. And finally, I took a brush and some black acrylic paint and painted all of the grills and wire mesh areas black in preparation for weathering. And that's about all the detailing I did to the model before I weathered it. I could have done more detailing, particularly around the fuel tank, fuel fillers, and some other underframe detailing, but I chose not to on this model. I hope that you learned something from the video and that you're able to take some of the things that you saw here and apply them to your own modeling. And I hope that you join me for the next installment in this series, which will be installing RailPro as well as a much larger speaker into the locomotive.